Good afternoon, everyone. On this beautiful afternoon, I have the honor of introducing Professor Charlie Beckett. Professor Beckett is the head of the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. The department celebrates its 10th anniversary this year in 2013. He is also the founding director of Polis, the department's journalism and society think tank. With 20 years of experience as a senior journalist and program editor at institutions such as the BBC, London Weekend Television, and Independent Television News, Professor Beckett has written and taught on media issues such as the role of journalism in civic society, ethical, journalistic issues, international journalism, and reporting on war and terror. Professor Beckett is the author of 2 recent books about network journalism, including Supermedia, Saving Journalism So It Can Save the World, and WikiLeaks, News in the Networked Era. In his own words, "I went into journalism because I think it matters how our world is reported. With all the technological and commercial changes in journalism and all the social, environmental, and political changes in society, I think that journalism matters even more now." So without further ado, Professor Charlie Beckett.
Thanks very much, Emma. It's really lovely to be here for a number of reasons, really. I was lucky enough to meet some Wellesley alumni in London, I think about a year ago, and had a really good session with them. So it was a pleasure to be invited to come and see, if you like, the next lot of alumni. It's also a pleasure because this particular lecture, it's great to be at the Albright Institute for the very obvious reason, if you think about the name of the person, the person it's named after, that she was obviously the first female Secretary of State, and then the other one that you've got at the moment, who I believe is also apparently linked to this place, this kind of monopoly supply. I've had a lot of contact with the State Department, partly with writing this book, but also more generally because I'm very interested in how journalism and the new forms of journalism I'm going to be talking about today, how they impact on governance, basically. And there is a fascinating debate, which I'll try and return to in the lecture going on in the State Department, about how should America use the kind of new tools that are out there, social media and so on, to kind of promote the goals of American foreign policy and economic policy and so on, but also how to protect America, perhaps, also from the risks inherent in these new forms of communication. So I hope that, I think this is a good setting for me to talk about this, because I know that you don't have a kind of straightforward media program at Wellesley, but that's good, because in a way I'm much more interested in talking to people from different backgrounds who perhaps academically have a different approach, maybe political science, economics, sociology, social psychology, and I'm also interested in people who are going to do other things in the world, and how, and my mission, if you like, is to try and convince you that media matters, as Emma referred to, that media matters in whatever you're going to do. Not just individually, your Facebook pages and how that might impact on your job hunting if you haven't cleaned them up, but also more generally how in your work and in your personal life, of course, how that might be, as I say, a kind of resource for you, but also some elements of risk as well. And it's partly because, as Emma mentioned, I'm a journalist by career, and I'm very unusual in my department in that, generally speaking, the LSE is about as different. I don't know if anybody been to the LSE? Great, fantastic. Well, then you know that it's about as different from Wellesley College, especially on a day like this, as you can imagine. I can't honestly think that there is a single tree in the LSE, for example. But I think we share an interest. The LSE's motto is to look into the causes of things, but very much because we want to change things as well. And change, we're all going to have an impact in our lives, and it's to make people more critical and thoughtful about how they might change things. And I think that's something we share as well. as I say, I'm unusual in the LSE, my department, because I had a previous career outside of academia. I'm now head of the department there. I'm now a professor, so I've sort of stopped referring to myself primarily as a journalist. I have to accept that I am now an educationalist, but it's that kind of relationship between, if you like, the outside world and the inside world that interests me. And the reason that I run Polis, the think tank at the LSE, was set up deliberately to try and act like a kind of portal between what is increasingly quite a cut-off academic world, I think, around the world, as it becomes more specialised, and the real world, if you like, and trying to act, especially for journalists, at a time of incredible crisis around the world, not just in the richer Western economies like America and Britain, where I'm sure you're all aware that newspaper people especially are feeling the economic heat. But more generally, you only have to think about places that are in the news recently, like Mali and Pakistan, and think about how important it is and how difficult it is to have good journalism in those places. So that's the kind of setting. Now, can I assume that you'd all heard of WikiLeaks? Anybody who had not heard of WikiLeaks before I turned up today? Or, yeah, that's good. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit about WikiLeaks. But in a sense, this lecture isn't just about WikiLeaks. It's not just about that particular organisation. I want you to think of it very much as a case study for media, but also more generally, as I say, a case study around political communications. And the question I'm going to ask, it sort of sounds like a bit of a dumb question, what was WikiLeaks? But actually, the debate about how you characterise WikiLeaks, for example, is it right to call it journalism, was really important. The second thing is, what does it mean for journalism? Because I think that we are familiar that WikiLeaks was a challenge to people like perhaps even the speaker you had this morning. And I'm sorry I missed that, but it was a challenge to the political system, a challenge to the diplomatic system. But it's very much also a huge challenge to journalism, especially mainstream journalism. And then finally, I want to ask, what does it signify for political communications? Not just in itself, but as an example, for example, to other people or other organisations. And there's the commercial break. This is the book that I wrote, and the writing of the book in itself sort of tells you something about the nature of WikiLeaks and the media environment that we're in. I started writing it back in October, let's get this right, 2010, I think, yes, when WikiLeaks exploded into the limelight. I don't know if you remember, but when the major leaks happened and it became a really hot topic, possibly the hottest topic, certainly in kind of media, for years. And so I started writing this book with a guy called James Ball, who had worked at one point for WikiLeaks and has now left WikiLeaks and works for the Guardian newspaper in London. And he's now hated by people who work for WikiLeaks. So there's a bit of an inside kind of track with the book. It tells the story of WikiLeaks. But most importantly, I was trying to get at what does it signify, if you like, for the subtitle, News in the Networked Era. Because, again, without wishing to go over my other book, Supermedia, which that was very much about how what's distinctive and I think interesting and different about news and political communications, how that works in the digital era, is that it is networked. And you probably all take this for granted. You're so-called digital natives. No tax is going to talk about this kind of thing. But it's had a profound impact on the way that news changed from the days when I used to do it for a living and how you consume it now. And some of those things are technological. I remember it was even at the beginning of my last job, so back in 2000, 2001, when I worked for a program called Channel 4 News, which is a bit like 60 Minutes in the States. And we had to ask if we could use the internet. We used to put up our hands and say, can I go and use the internet? Because there was only one terminal that was internet enabled. Now, of course, when I wander around with this lovely product from Apple, this has probably got more computing power. Well, I know it's got more computing power than the whole of that newsroom that I worked in back then, and enables me to do journalism, you know, instantly. And you do it all the time, don't you? You do all that stuff, you know, and I do that without your consent, and then I put it onto Twitter, and you know, and everyone has a good laugh. And that's the point, that it's now networked, that you can take that picture and put it on Twitter, and people then know that this guy from the LSE is talking at Wellesley, etc., etc. So that's the bit I'm trying to get at with this, is this idea of how different is news in the networked era. And that's really what my research has been about since I've been at the LSE. And WikiLeaks, as I say, is important because it's a case study for the future of journalism, how it's changing. You know, the internet didn't just come in and then we all got blogs and then it stopped. It's constantly evolving. I think it's central to the debate about the open internet, this idea of who controls cyberspace. You know, it's not like the air that we breathe. You know, the internet, the World Wide Web, are created things that are controlled by people or facilitated by people. At the moment, they're remarkably open. There are all sorts of pressures to try and restrict that, partly in response to things like WikiLeaks, but partly also for corporate pressures, for example. I'm sure you're all conscious of, you know, how many people here are on Facebook? How many people not on Facebook? Ah, the resistance. Well, obviously, those of you on Facebook, and I don't know why you aren't on Facebook, it may be something to do with your concerns about privacy. It may be something to do with your concerns about what Mark Zuckerberg is going to do with your data, and so on. So there's that constant tension about how the internet works. And then finally, I think WikiLeaks is one of the areas, a kind of battleground for the nature of political communications. This struggle between, you know, who controls the message. In the good old days, when I was an editor, it was me. I told you what I thought that you needed to hear. And I told you what, generally speaking, a bunch of politicians and judges and so on would let me tell you as well. Now, increasingly, you're able to go directly to find the information yourselves and to spread that information yourselves. And I think that WikiLeaks is an example of that trend. I'm not sure what you do to get rid of the adverts on these, but anybody want to rent a studio in San Diego? Hands up those of you who have seen this video. It's the collateral murder video about American troops operating in Baghdad. Hands up if you have seen it. Good, okay, well I will play a bit. I should say it's quite disturbing, so quite seriously, I don't want to offend anybody. I'm not going to play you horribly gruesome bits, it's not, but it is quite shocking. So is anybody feeling, you know, particularly sensitive today? No? Okay. It's not sort of, I mean, it is upsetting. I mean, because, and this is the point of this. This was, you know, WikiLeaks was set up 2006, and originally it was a site. It's got nothing to do with Wikipedia. You know, a wiki is something that, I don't know if anybody of you have worked on a wiki, but a wiki is a collaborative piece of online work where you know, a bunch of people get together and create a website and they contribute to it and chip in, etc. Just like Wikipedia. You're all familiar with Wikipedia. Your main research tool, I'm sure. Now, WikiLeaks isn't a wiki. It's not collaborative. It's not open. What WikiLeaks was a secure Dropbox for people to leak classified information. So if you, for example, found out that Wellesley College had been embezzling loads of your fees and you managed to get a document that showed that there was a secret investigation into the corruption here at Wellesley, you would be able to send it to WikiLeaks. And they had invented a piece of software where you could send that information electronically without anybody knowing where it had come from. Okay, so no fingerprints, no source, no nothing. It's a perfectly secure way, that was the idea anyway, of enabling people to whistleblow, to hand over information. And they promised that if what you sent them was genuinely a leak, then they would publish it. Didn't matter what it was, they would try and publish it. And they came up with a system, this software system for hiding the source, but also they had evolved this system of servers spread around, well, initially I think it was in Sweden, but eventually they had mirror servers which enabled the information to be spread around servers around the world. So again, it was no point the police turning up and turning off one of WikiLeaks' servers, because the information would have been spread around and in practice was impossible to suppress. Now in that first stage, they were getting all kinds of leaks. Some of them were quite interesting and significant. There was one, for example, about corruption in Kenya, which when it came out had quite an impact on elections in Kenya and stirred the political debate in East Africa. Others were much less serious. So, for example, there were a whole load of leaks from, and I always get this wrong, what they're called sonority clubs, in American college. What? Sorority. Sorry. Thank you. Sonority is something else, isn't it? Yeah. Sorority clubs. Anyway, and it was, the sort of secret codes for all that stuff. Do you guys do that stuff here? Well, you're not going to tell me if you do, are you? No. Anyway, and they published this. Now, it was, who cares? Who cares, really? It just really annoyed a lot of people who were running those clubs and spoiled a lot of people's fun. But it wasn't, this was not going to change the world. And so WikiLeaks bumbled along like this. People kind of knew about it, but it wasn't having much of an impact. And Julian Assange, who was the founder of WikiLeaks, very much wanted to have an impact. If you read his early writings, he talks about the world as being a kind of conspiracy of power to control information so that they cannot be held account for the bad things that they do, which, in a sense, is quite a traditional thing. Most journalists think that. They think that people are hiding things so they can get on with bad stuff that they're doing. And generally speaking, that's true. If you want to do bad stuff, you can do it in public. Saddam Hussein did a lot of things in public that were very bad. But it's always easier to do things secretly. So his idea was that if he could publish information, the secret information, he could expose not just the wrongdoing, but the system of power. The way that power, especially in the modern digital age, power depends, when it wants to run an economy or a war, it depends on that information and keeping that information classified. And I guess that's partly one of the jobs of the speaker that you had this morning is to try and keep that information private so that they can do their job. The one thing that changed all this was a massive leak of information, which we now know came allegedly from somebody who's currently on trial, Private Bradley Manning, who allegedly leaked a vast, vast amount of information. And again, if you talk to the State Department, they are very, very cross with the Department of Defense for this stuff getting out. And it was a colossal, unprecedented leak of information. The first we knew about it, though, was this video, which I'm going to play you in a second. And I'm just going to play you some little snatches of it. We haven't got time to play lots of it. You can go and look on YouTube and see it for yourself. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of it. But just to quickly tell you the story of it, it's an Apache helicopter, an American Forces Apache helicopter, which was doing patrols in Baghdad during the Iraq War. And its job was basically to go around finding groups of insurgents and attack them. And what you hear is this is the cockpit video. So this was material that the American forces routinely record as part of their operations. So I'm going to play a little bit of it just to give you a flavour. It's so nice to get rid of this thing. There we go. So. So I should explain that the point of this is that this is the only, the video is completely unedited. It's 40 minutes long. It's raw footage. wind it on.
Roger that. We have no personnel east of our position, so you are free to engage over. All right, we'll be engaging. Roger, go ahead. I can't get them down there behind that building. Anybody been building a company? We got an RPG. All right, we got a guy with an RPG. Having a fire? Can you hold the left, come around? We can go into our point of view.
Can you make this out at all? Can you read it just about? Yeah, sorry.
Right in front of the Brad. About there at 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then. Just fucking. Once you get on, just open it. Okay, Roger. I see your element. You got about 400 meters along this. You're clear. All right, firing. What's the baseline? Let me know when you get it. What you light them all up. Two traffic, 260. Come on, fire.
Okay. Now, the film moves on, and what happens is that the helicopter keeps circulating, and a little truck, an MPV kind of truck, turns up, and they try and get some of the injured people into this truck. And this is, you know, Iraqis who are driving the truck, and they're trying to get some bodies into the truck. And the helicopter, again, decides to attack that and asks permission to attack the truck, and attacks the truck and blows up the truck with the people in it. It turns out the truck actually had 2 children in it. They were on their way to school, and the guy had stopped to try and help these people. Amazingly, the children survived, albeit with serious injuries. Now, these people here, 2 of the people killed in this were actually employees of Reuters, the news organisation. A cameraman and a researcher, I think it was. So in effect, the Americans had, you know, by mistake, obviously, killed 2 journalists. Now, what's your sort of reaction, just in a word or two, what's your sort of reaction to this, or what's special about this, or what's different about this from your point of view? Obviously, for the people who haven't seen it. What's different about this? Anybody? Compared to the kind of news coverage you generally get of conflicts like the Iraq War. Please.
You don't see the other side firing first. It's not a responsive act. It's more of a preemptive.
Yeah, you're talking about the actual event, yeah, that they, you know, you're seeing some soldiers attacking people, as it were, out of the blue, yeah?
We haven't seen much before when they started shooting, but it does seem fairly cavalier.
Yeah, yeah. So you're hearing about motives, please?
My first impression is I'm not getting a complete picture.
Good, yeah. In what sense?
I just, I've only seen like 2 minutes of it, so I don't know.
Sure.
I need a complete picture to actually know what's going on.
Very important point.
I didn't see the immediate threat, so when they were talking about, they said, I think it was like 8 or 6 when they saw the guns, but I was looking for the guns, but I couldn't see them. So, but usually when we see images of the war, we see like direct military, or we see the weapons, and we see, okay, this is why they're reacting, because there's like a threat.
Very good point, exactly. This is wonderful, this is beautiful. Keep going.
I was going to say, just in one word, it seemed very impulsive.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Go on.
It sounded to me like they were enjoying it,
Yeah.
which is a little disturbing.
Isn't war fun? Yeah. There's a fantastic range of responses, and they're all to do with what we're trying to show with this. The amazing thing about this is that you ain't seen nothing like it before. You will never see, and no one's seen it since either, interestingly, but nobody in the public had seen 40 minutes of raw footage. This is what war is like. if you're in an Apache helicopter anyway. And it's very complicated, wasn't it? You know, the constant conversations they're having. They can't just ride into town and shoot people up. They have to keep asking permission. And they're actually, sometimes you see these examples where they're actually getting legal advice. Am I allowed to engage? You'll see one section where they're about to shoot somebody and they can't shoot him until he picks up a gun, because that would be shooting somebody who's defenseless. Now, it's a very fine point, because if you're in an Apache helicopter, waiting for someone to pick up a gun or not, you know, it doesn't make much difference in terms of their threat to you. But it's very interesting that uppermost in those soldiers' minds, even while they're apparently very impulsive and enjoying this and emotionally engaged and probably bloody frightened, because, you know, Apache helicopters get shot down as well. So you're getting an extraordinary amount of information that you would not get except in a sort of, you know, what's the word, melodramatic format in a Hollywood movie. That's the only time you see that kind of conflict, isn't it? And this is the real deal. This is the thing. This is real people. And you're seeing it in real time as well. Isn't war slow in a way? You know, as I say, they don't just tip up and start shooting. It's quite a laborious process. And as somebody else mentioned, you know, there are ethical issues here. You know, how do we know that these were insurgents? As it turns out, a couple of them weren't. So there's possibility that this was a war crime, although I could see entirely how you can make the opposite case. Did anybody pick up on why they opened the shoot? Did you hear him say, that's, I always get these initials wrong, is it RPV? RPG. RPG, thank you, see, yeah. That's a humanities education for you. Yeah, exactly. So they thought, these guys were convinced that there was a, you know, rocket-propelled grenade which can be used to take out helicopters. So, you know, they didn't think these guys were on the way to the grocery store. But it's extraordinary how it allows you to make all these fascinating judgments and insights, and also to, you know, your point, thinking, hang on a minute, have I got the information here? You know, is it set in context? You weren't allowed to do that before. I would have edited that material down to a couple of minutes. I probably wouldn't have, well, I certainly would not have been given it by the military. They would have handed out just one little segment that would have told the story they wanted to tell. Now, WikiLeaks did another version of this. Again, I'm just going to play a little bit of it. I wonder what interesting adverts we'll get this time. And I want you to see how different. This is a much shorter version, 7 or 8 minutes, which they've edited. And what they did, they also sent researchers to Baghdad to interview people and to interview the families, especially the families of the guys who'd been shot. And they edited it together into this version, which, as you can see at the beginning, has graphics, has a kind of introduction. It's much like a presenter might read out on a news show. Although obviously you can see that, and I'm going to just whip through this a little bit. So, for example, they did research, they talked to the family, you get told exactly who these people are before the film starts. Okay. And then the actual film itself is different, it's much shorter and it's edited, and it also, there you go. So I'll just take it back. There, sorry. So it's got things like that, where they're pointing out to you what the guy thought was a RPG is actually a camera that he's holding. So I'll stop it there, because you can go back and look at it yourself, and you know the film unfolds. Now, can you see what's happened there? You know, that in a sense they're doing what you said. Can you give me some more context? Can you tell me more about what's actually going on here, rather than just the subtitles? And in that sense, they're also doing something, you know, in that stuff at the beginning. That's, I guess, what you call propaganda, isn't it? Or I think the academic phrase is normative. You know, that it's got a point of view, that it's campaigning. They're trying to convince you of the case, which is, as they call this video, collateral murder. They think that a war crime happened, and they think this is the evidence of it. And so they've edited the film, including things like the graphics. So, for example, the graphic says the camera. What it doesn't show is you can actually see elsewhere where they haven't got an RPG, but they've definitely got other weaponry with them. So, as I say, these are not, in inverted commas, innocent people. So what WikiLeaks is doing at this point is really interesting, that it's stopped being a pure leak platform. Instead of saying, bring me your leaks and I'll shove them out, it's actually turning itself into quite a conventional journalistic organisation. And that's sort of what I did for a living. I used to take bits of material and chop them up to tell a story, you know, to give a narrative which I would think would explain a particular event in a way that I think you would believe, and that generally speaking I thought was, you know, kind of objective, kind of impartial, kind of balanced. You can never get those things perfectly right, but that's journalism. It's a formulaic, partial view of the world. That's all it can be, because we can't all sit around watching 40 minutes of unedited video all the time. Okay? So it's a very interesting moment, this, for WikiLeaks, where it's become networked. Now, the trouble was that it didn't bloody work for them. Julian Assange wanted to change the world. He wanted to get people's attention. He wanted to shock you, as I hope you would be shocked if you watched that video in full. And therefore, he wanted to have an impact on politics and on diplomacy, and indeed on the actual war that was then still ongoing in Iraq. But it didn't. The American government got very cross with people like Joe Lieberman saying, you know, this guy's a terrorist and WikiLeaks must be shut down, and can we switch off the internet, that kind of thing. But actually it didn't have much impact. It didn't get enough media attention. It was a bit of a kind of one-day wonder, although hundreds of thousands of people looked at it. So what does Julian Assange do? He decides to team up with a bunch of people who have got the attention of the public, who have got the ears or eyes of opinion formers and people in power, and that is mainstream media. People like the New York Times. And you get this remarkable collaboration, which I'm not going to go into detail. There's, you know, some very good books about it, and I go in detail in my book about it. Quite extraordinary collaboration. I mean, it's difficult enough to get people like The Guardian, the New York Times, and Spiegel to collaborate on anything. You know, journalism is intensely competitive. But to get them to collaborate with this weird guy, this blonde Australian anarchist type chap, this hacker, this leaker, to collaborate with him was a real effort. Now, why did they do it? Because there was an extraordinary treasure trove. When Julian Assange turned up with his, literally with his laptop that he pulled out and started showing Bill Keller from the New York Times or Alan Rusbridger from The Guardian this stuff, it blew their minds. And quite rightly, they felt that it was important to get this information out there. And this is just one example of how the New York Times did it. And again, I won't go into detail, but there was the video came out, but also that came out was the series of war logs. These are the dispatches from Afghanistan and from Iraq, and later we found out also the diplomatic cables. Hundreds of thousands of electronic documents. Now, what would happen if they just stuck all that stuff online? You know, so what? You'd have just drowned in the information. And as you were saying, you know, what's the context? What does it mean? What effect would it have had? Instead, when they did it with people like the New York Times, they're able to do it in a slightly different way. First of all, though, they are able to give you the real thing. Normally, I mean, if the New York Times had been leaked just one of these bits of documents, that would have been front page news, and they'd have made a big deal about it. But actually to show the public, and they didn't release all of them immediately, but to show the public the actual documents that you're talking about, again, is extraordinary. It's the journalist saying not, hey, look, I've got a secret, I'm going to tell you about it. It's, hey, I've got a secret, and I'm going to show you. So you can judge for yourself, and you can look at it for yourself. You may have specialist knowledge. So you can see it, and it's indecipherable. If you read this stuff, it's full of jargon, it's full of acronyms, and a lot of them have got kind of code words or code numbers. So generally speaking, this one's a bit more intelligible actually. So you can sort of work out, but you know, Salim chose Dulamiya because he allegedly trained in Iran on how to conduct precision military-style kidnappings, brackets NFI. You know, who's he? What does it mean? Why Iran? Now, the usefulness of doing it with the New York Times was firstly that they were able to filter all this stuff, but also they were able to tell you about it. So the New York Times, alongside it, was able to publish analysis and maps, the kind of stuff that you're familiar with mainstream journalism, which helps to tell the story, helps you to understand it. If you can understand it, then you're more likely to pay attention to it and more likely to realise its significance. That's really what journalism is about. So that's what you've got happening here with the New York Times, and then with the Guardian as well, and they're able to use their skills in doing, you know, neat things like this, where they're able to use their data journalism skills to create graphic devices like this, which is One Day in Afghanistan. And it's based on the documentation, but what they've done, they've turned it into a data visualization, so you can see how during that day various incidents happen, and you're able to click on them. Oh, you can stop them and get more information. And actually, so if you click on that one, it'll tell you what it is, and it'll take you back to the original documentation. Now, this is all fantastic. It's extraordinary. The volume of it was absolutely unprecedented. It was easily the biggest leak of classified information in the history of humankind. But it mattered because it was also telling a story that was quite challenging to the conventional account. It was showing, for example, that in Afghanistan far more civilians, you know, the collateral damage, were being killed than the official, you know, the Americans and the British were allowing for. It told a story of, in Iraq, for example, where the constant messaging from the military was, yep, we're getting on top of this, we're moving progressively, things are getting better, but the actual evidence, which was evidence from the US military itself, was telling a different story. It was telling actually about increased violence and increased dispersal of the violence into areas that were supposed to be under control. So it was telling, you know, regardless of what you think about the wars, regardless of, you know, what you think about what US or British military was doing, it was doing what journalism is supposed to do, which is to challenge accepted conventional wisdom and try at least to tell you what the hell is really going on. And in this case of this network journalism, it was using all these new technologies and collaboration alongside, if you like, the traditional skills of those journalists who know about Pakistan, they know about Iraq, they know about Afghanistan, and they're able to bring that combination to create something which I think is much more powerful than we were able to do in the past. And so you have that, what I call network journalism, that collaboration between professional, mainstream organisations and the public and other organisations as well. And as I say, the importance of this is, yes, wow, WikiLeaks is amazing, but it's also to think about, you know, what is significant about it. One of the things we always ask when we look at new phenomena like this, new media like this, is, well, is it really that new? And some aspects of it are not new. There's nothing new about leaking information to journalists. There's nothing new about journalists breaking the law. There's a long tradition of that. There's a long tradition of political or radical journalism as well. Journalism has always had very charismatic individuals. You know, Bill Riley, for example, people like that. So again, the fact that Julian Assange is such a polite word, charismatic person is nothing unusual. In that sense, WikiLeaks was a source. It was a news agency. It was providing material for those journalists. But I'd argue this is what is new about WikiLeaks. Firstly, this thing I mentioned at the beginning, the immunity, that try as it will, the most powerful nation on God's earth has not been able to close WikiLeaks down or stop it. You know, they tried to withdraw the servers, they tried to withdraw the PayPal, but you know, Julian Assange has not been prosecuted for WikiLeaks. The risk calculation, WikiLeaks has a different risk calculation. Because it's got that immunity, it doesn't have to worry in the same way that the New York Times or the Guardian has to worry about, you know, being prosecuted in the courts, or by having political pressure put upon it, or commercial pressure put upon it. So in that sense, it has a different risk calculation, and that's important. The scale and efficiency, I think, you know, you can tell that it's extraordinary, the amount of material they were able to put on. And remember, this is a tiny, tiny organisation. You know, there are fewer people working for WikiLeaks than worked for the local newspaper that I started my career on. You know, it's a tiny organisation. And finally, what I think is new about it, and this is a kind of media theory thing, is this idea that it's a networked exploit. That WikiLeaks was able to exploit the network of the internet to spread it, to get the leaks in, to keep them secure and then spread them out. But it was also able to exploit the network of mainstream media. The New York Times, The Guardian, and increasingly, I think, about 80 to 100 other media organisations around the world. So in that sense, again, it's a very interesting example of how the internet creates hybrid organisations that are able to operate in different ways. But, as you're probably familiar, hands up, who knows where Julian Assange is as we speak? What? Where? No, they want to. They want to. Some South American country. Come on. You know, you should be familiar with your flags of Latin American countries. It is, of course, the Ecuadorian embassy. Yeah, the Ecuadorian embassy, bless them, have, again, I'll just truncate it very quickly. You know, basically he's facing these Swedish allegations. Let's not go into it now. But that has been extremely damaging to WikiLeaks because WikiLeaks is so dependent upon Julian Assange himself. But even before those allegations had broken, WikiLeaks itself was already, let's call it crumbling under the pressure of its relationship with the other media organisations, personality clashes, and the trouble it was having to create a sustainable operational model. So it is quite possible that, you know, having started writing this book in, whenever it was, autumn 2010, you know, by spring 2013, we could say that WikiLeaks might almost be over. It's not, you know, it's still operating, it still tries to release, it's increasingly dependent on other organisations like Anonymous, you know, the hacking collective. But it's possible that it is, in effect, over. Which does that mean we should forget it? I would argue no, we shouldn't. That's nice. I suddenly see you all. Because I think what you have to remember is that whether Assange stays in the embassy or goes to Sweden or whatever happens to WikiLeaks, we can see that it's just, in a sense, while it was spectacular, it's just one of many examples of other networked exploits, of other internet-based, digitally driven political communications phenomenon. You only have to think about, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Arab Spring and the role that social media, alongside mainstream media, you know, the Arab news channels, played in helping to catalyse those revolutions. Didn't create them, of course, but it helped to catalyse them. You're probably familiar, you may be familiar with protests across Europe with the ongoing austerity crisis. Increasingly, those are being used, much as the Occupy movement in the States and elsewhere, where social media played a role, and even in lovely England, with our riots the summer before last, where BlackBerry Messenger was a critical part of the organisation of them, and there was a sense that social media may have helped make them the most diverse, geographically dispersed and prevalent civil disorder that Britain has had for a long, long, long time. So the point about this is, you know, is actually the most dangerous person, if you like, in the world not someone like Julian Assange, but is it actually somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, unintentionally, But these social networks, these social platforms are possibly offering more challenging forms of media. So when you think about, you know, if you are in power, who are you frightened of? Well, it could be these chaps, not just because they've got a gun. These are the Syrian Free Army, you know, the opposition in Syria. Not just because they got guns and weapons, but also they were utterly brilliant at using social media to get their message out. So in the early months of that conflict, when journalists couldn't go to Syria and you didn't know what was going on, the Syrian Free Army was bouncing out endless streams of videos and interviews and images of what they said were atrocities and so on. As they were happening, you would have live interviews with people, you know, standing in, next to bomb wreckage in Damascus or wherever, showing you instantly the bodies of children who had been allegedly killed by the Syrian government army. And that was critical to get the rest of the world to pay attention. It meant that journalists, the BBC or CNN, would be using that material. They'd be taking it from YouTube and putting it on the nighttime news bulletins. And so you were able to see directly, and of course politicians in places like the States were also able to see directly, and that's how it got on the agenda. So if you're in power, do you fear that person, or perhaps you fear Martha Payne, aged 9? Anybody heard of Martha Payne? I don't know, there's no reason why you should have done. Have you heard of Martha Payne? Yeah, great. Martha Payne lives in Argyll and Bute, which is a very lovely part of Scotland. Scotland is a country that is yearning to be free from the yoke of British imperialism. They're trying to get independence, or some of them are. But anyway, at the moment it's part of the country I live in, Britain, and she had her blog. She was a 9-year-old blogger. She blogged about school dinners. I don't know if you get school dinners in the States, but in British schools, you know, at lunchtime you get school dinners, and they're kind of notorious, perhaps unfairly, for not being very nice. So she had a blog called School Dinners, which kind of reviewed the meal every day. And amazingly, this was not terribly popular with her school. And they kind of tolerated it, but then the Educational Authority closed it down and said, stop, you can't blog anymore. Now, what happens when a blogger gets told by somebody in power they can't blog anymore? Who comes to the rescue? Or what comes to the rescue? Begins with T, ends with R. Twitter. There was a massive, massive storm on Twitter. And within, I think, 4 or 5 hours, the authority had to reverse its decision and allow her to go back to blogging. And the nice bit of it was that she was also able, because of the publicity she got, she used that publicity to raise about $100,000 to provide food for school kids in Africa, which was a nice thing. Now, obviously, Martha has not brought down a government. She's not revealed the, you know, abuses of the military. And yet, she shows you how nobody is now, at least potentially, immune from the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear by this kind of journalism. She was a journalist. She was blogging about food. And if you're 9 years old, your school dinners matter. And indeed, they do matter, you know, nutrition, we're going to think about it. And so the balance of power had been changed. And what you saw there in this humble little way was how, the terms of political trade have been changed by the internet, social media, etc. The other reason why she is so particularly dangerous is that we don't know what she's going to do over the next 5 years. You know, is she going to do more of this stuff? Are people of her generation going to use these tools? And if so, how are they going to use them? Are they going to use them in political communications? And if so, how are they going to do that? You know, is this a force for democracy, or is it just a force for, you know, online bullying or something? And that unpredictability is very, very important when you are trying to understand how power operates in the future. And that's why, and I'm coming to the end now, you know, I would characterize this as an age of complexity and uncertainty. This isn't just because I'm not, you know, it's not just because I'm stupid and don't understand it. I'm convinced that this is the case, both in the real world and in the media world. I think it's at least arguable, and the sort of, you know, political scientists and so on amongst you would have a better opinion perhaps, that we live in an incredibly complex age. And you have to think about issues like climate change, the economy. I mean, who really understands? Does anybody really understand the fiscal cliff? You know? Then think about your own personal lives. Think about how you're going to have to get your welfare, your health sorted out. You have to think about, well, you're obviously doing your education. You then may have to think about your children's education. You may have to work out things like, you know, just the complexity of consumer culture, all the choices that you have to make. Then think about how your country might change, how your community might change with things like immigration or biotech, how those sciences might impact on your lives. And fun enough, none of them seem to make it less complex. They all seem to introduce more uncertainty and complexity. Now, the same thing I think is happening in media. If you think about the number of sources that you've got available, if you want to know any given bit of information, you know, how did the Patriots do last night? Very well, we now know. But if you wanted to know that last night, think of all the different ways you could have found that out. You might have gone to Twitter or Facebook, you might have listened to the radio or the TV, you might even just ask somebody in a Boston bar and they would have told you. But so there's that complexity also, of course, about you and what you can do as a media producer, that you are, as I've said, all able to use and produce and create and communicate in lots of different ways. Now, complexity and uncertainty, I don't know about you, but you know, they've got a kind of negative connotation. We all yearn for simplicity and certainty. It's a very human thing to do. And yet, if you think about it, complexity can also mean diversity. It can mean richness. It can mean choice. These are all great things. When you think about uncertainty as well, uncertainty, well, it means you don't quite know what's going to happen. But that's good, because if things aren't predictable, then things might change. And they might change in a way that you want. They might not. But that therefore offers you, again, a sense of choice as an individual and as a community and as a society as well. And I think there's a very interesting interaction going on, interrelationship there going on between complexity and uncertainty in the real world and how we think, how we mediate it, how we understand the real world. You know, that some people feel that, you know, the complexity of media, you know, the constant barrage of information and data in itself makes you think the world is more complex than it is, and that, you know, it's a kind of media effect. But regardless of that, I think it's all in play. And how do you respond to that? Don't know. That's when I think it's over to you, and it's for you to think about, not just as media consumers or media producers, but also to think about it in terms of, you know, whatever specialism, whatever area of life that you're going into, whatever it is, health, education, doesn't matter. And I think key to that, and I would say this because I am a journalist, but key to that, I think, is an understanding of this idea of journalism. This idea that, do we need people or software programs or networks that enable us to filter that information, to understand that information, to connect that information to other people, to distribute that information in ways that will help us to understand the kind of choices that we've got going forward. And I think that, if you like, is something we can't answer, but it's something that we've got to think seriously about, and more important than just seriously think about, I think we've got to act upon as well. And that's it. Thank you very much. We've got time, so if you want to have a conversation, I'd be very interested in your reaction. If there's anything I've missed or any questions that you've got, very happy to follow up. And I should say as well that, you know, it's great to be able to be here physically, but if people want to follow up in the future, if you're, you know, if you're at all interested in these issues, or and it may be that it'll kind of crop up later, you know, in the year or in your lives, please get in touch. I'm very easy to find. As it says there, there's my contact details. Always very happy and interested to hear about people doing research that's related. We have a summer school. You're all, welcome to apply for that. And if you're ever in London, please get in touch as well. Come and see us. But any questions or any thoughts?
Hi, my name is Shu Yu. Can you elaborate a little bit on the difference between Sweden, United States, and these democratic countries pressing on Julian Assange, and a country like China, which is a communist country, censoring its media? Is there any difference between them?
Well, superficially, not always, because in China there are strict media laws, and there is a sort of kind of strict control over editorial policy. But generally speaking, people have often been prosecuted under other pretexts. So you get you either get prosecuted for treason, but often it's for kind of economic crimes. People who are outspoken bloggers. I mean, Ai Weiwei, the artist and writer who was recently imprisoned, he was done, as I understand it, for tax. So one of the theories goes, one of the many, many conspiracy theories around Julian Assange goes that the authorities have deliberately got these two Swedish women to press charges against Julian Assange so that they can get Julian Assange over to Sweden, so the Americans can then extradite him from Sweden, so they can do something to him here, put him in front of a grand jury, I guess. It's absolute rubbish. If that was what the Americans wanted to do, then it's the most complicated, bizarre way to go about it. There are so many easier ways that they could have done to prosecute Julian or to close down WikiLeaks. And indeed, they have tried to. They tried to, well, not directly. This is part of what I was referring to earlier about there's a kind of battle within the State Department, which, put very briefly, was, on the one hand, people in the State Department love all this new media. They love what's happening in the Arab world. Well, up to a point, they're like, they're spending billions of dollars. I was in Washington in the autumn talking to people. Fascinating trip, got to speak to Leo Panetta and people like that. They're spending billions of dollars on giving tools and training to activists around the world to try and get them to be more democratic, probably including in China. On the other hand, they didn't like it when it happened to them, when WikiLeaks came along and leaked the material. But the difference was that, I'm not, what's the word? After 20 years in journalism, you're not terribly naive. But I think the difference is that America, generally speaking, and Sweden's a bit of an irrelevance here, but generally speaking, America has not acted directly to censor organisations like WikiLeaks. And it's just because it's too hard for them to do it, because every time they do it, there's an incredible outcry. There is actually a judicial process in the States. Bradley Manning has been treated absolutely appallingly. And I think, those kind of lapses shame countries like America and Britain. But they shame them, and that's the point, is that we are able to shame them, and that we are able to at least try to stop them from doing it. I think, interestingly, what's happening in China is that we are at least seeing signs of a similar process. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. When I talk to my Chinese friends, they say that in many ways there's worse violent censorship of journalism in China now than there has been for a long time. And that's partly because, as you're probably familiar, there's a kind of power struggle going on at the moment within the Chinese elite and within the Chinese Communist Party about how it retains control over the economic powerhouse that China is, and how it copes with things like Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, and how the system is adjusting, so you do now have very outspoken social media and indeed mainstream media locally attacking corruption in China. And that is less censored, it's less suppressed, partly because it's so difficult to do so. Even with all the controls that the Chinese government has, it's very difficult when you've got hundreds of millions of people on a social networking site to keep control of everything they say. And so you are seeing increasing signs of, and you probably know more about this than me, but are in China of a similar process at least, where people are in some way able to resist that kind of strict censorship. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, no, I don't think you can compare directly the two. I mean, Sweden's a weird place, but the idea that the Swedes are somehow in the pay of the CIA or the State Department, and that these women deliberately brought these charges, is bizarre and quite insulting to them. Whoever.
For your talk, I think it was very insightful. My name is Farheen, and I wanted to ask you about the future of journalism in terms of being disruptive. I think you mentioned how Julian Assange was able to do this because he was unaccountable in some sense. He didn't have a board, he didn't have a chairman, he didn't have any other vested interests with people to be accountable to. And journalism as we see it today is accountable. Journalists are accountable to people in some sense. So barring the technological barriers that they may have, is there any way for the current world of journalism to affect impact without being disruptive?
Sorry, to the last sentence?
To make as big an impact in the world without being disruptive?
I think the answer is no to the last one. But that's kind of the very nature of, and WikiLeaks wasn't the first alternative media organisation. It was certainly the most powerful and the most effective for some of the reasons that I described. But mainly because it had an extraordinary leak. I mean, one thing you have to remember, that there hasn't been another leak like this since. In the last 2-3 years, there's not been another leak like it. The world has not suddenly become a free and open place where we all know exactly what, the military and certainly, in places like China. One of the points about the WikiLeaks was that it was, and the diplomatic cables and so on, was that it was because the American government is relatively open. It's relatively easier to leak from them. It's much harder to get leaks from China. WikiLeaks was originally set up to get leaks from places like China and Russia, and it's failed dismally to do that because there just isn't the same, within those bureaucracies in Russia and China, there isn't the same record keeping. You won't get Russian military guys in a helicopter recording themselves all the time. They don't need to, they don't bother. They're beyond that. But your point about disruptive journalism, I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm a very sort of centrist, mainstream, traditional journalist. And in a sense, my job at the BBC and ITN was always to go back to the centre. It's to say, hey, this guy's saying something radical here and somebody else is saying something radical there. What's the balanced view, But I recognise, because I am that kind of journalist, how important it is to have people who will take the risks and who will say things that are so outspoken. Sometimes they're going to be wrong. Sometimes they're just going to be simplistic. Sometimes they're just going to be, biased or, have a very narrow point of view. But sometimes they're going to be right. And the most important thing is if they're bringing real information into the public arena. It's one thing to say, I think Obama is wrong, or I think Romney is wrong, or I think they're evil. But it's another thing to show me evidence, like the famous 47% video. That was an incredible piece of radical journalism. It was an interesting example, actually, of network journalism, because it was, we still don't know, but we think it was the waiter or the barman who leaked it to, what's it called, Mother Jones, the magazine, a journalist who worked very hard to build up that relationship and get that information, and who then put it in the public domain. And as you all know, it had some impact on the election. Now, if Newsweek could, would Newsweek have got that information? Would they have treated it in the same way? Or CBS News? I don't know. So that's, the simple answer is, the wonderful thing now is that we don't have to rely on people like me anymore. Just go ahead, yeah.
Very much for your thoughts and insights into WikiLeaks. I have a question in relationship to the video that you showed. In some respects, one of the difficulties of the nature of warfare that is being fought at the moment is that there are these non-state networks that are being addressed, and so there's no counterpoint exactly to a video from a state-waged warfare against insurgency warfare on the ground. And I'm wondering, what is the implication of this networked media in relationship to a more networked warfare?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not an expert. I regularly go to talk to NATO in their Rome headquarters to discuss those issues. It's fascinating. Of course, you know, it can be to the advantage of the military. The American GI blogs, for example, the American forces were the first to encourage their troops to blog, personal blogs about, even when they were saying war is hell. Why? Because it was a brilliant propaganda and recruiting tool. Because, you know, Americans, you know, you're patriotic. Generally speaking, you're sympathetic to some guy who's fighting in a very unpleasant place. And in a strange way, it's quite exciting. You know, so those blogs were deliberately allowed, even when they weren't always, what's the word? Wasn't all smooth, as a way of allowing channels of information that were useful to them. It wasn't conventional propaganda, but the whole, you know, it's a whole thing. I do a lecture on it in next month, but it's a whole area in itself. The relationship that's been going on for a long time. The best book about it is a book by Philip Knightley called The First Casualty, which is the sort of best traditional history of the constant battle between journalism and the military to tell the truth about conflict, which is perhaps the most important form of journalism that you can have. And of course, I would argue now that that context has shifted, because you do now have these, as you put it, non-state actors and civilians, you know, the public, who are also in some ways able to tell their stories. Please.
So my name is Elza, and you mentioned that there hasn't been a big leak since WikiLeaks, but I think I would have to disagree with you and bring up the leaks in education, such as the UK has recently, and I'm not an expert on this, but I read that the UK has recently agreed to open a lot of its scientific and scholarly journals to the public. You can get any scholarly journal on Reddit by just asking for a person to post the PDF if you don't have access to the journal or a subscription. And recently, Wellesley and other colleges have joined edX, and where we open our classrooms to the internet for anyone who can learn. And so my question to you is, what is your opinion of the impact of education being opened and leaked to everybody?
Yeah, well, it's not leaked in the sense that, how can I put this, in that it's sort of voluntary. And I say only sort of because there are a lot of academics who can think of nothing more frightening and horrifying than actually having to allow people access to their information. Because if you think about it, the academic career is actually about keeping your information. I don't have a conventional academic career, so I can afford to be snide about this. But because you know, my whole raison d'etre is to, if I know something, I want to tell the world. But of course, as an academic, you work very hard to get this knowledge, and you're very keen that it's kept in a protected space so that you can benefit from it, so that you can enhance your career, so your university can get students to come to it, and so that people have to come to you for the knowledge that you have. And so in that sense, it is a parallel with what journalists used to do. We used to keep the information and let you have it if you paid us money or whatever. And indeed, I think you can look across a whole range of organisations which are being disintermediated. The idea that where previously they had control of information and you as the civilian had to access it through somebody else, now increasingly those networks are being opened up. I think there's a sort of specific thing around academic information which I think will have a big impact on, you heard the phrase MOOCs, mass online, what's it called, mass, what's the, what? Online open, I always forget the open bit, yeah. Courses, which are going to make a lot of money for some venture capitalists, are going to make some money, I guess, for academics doing them, and allegedly are going to disintermediate the idea of the university. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think you know, your learning experience of someone like Wellesley is not something that you could necessarily have done in front of a screen in your bedroom. And the dropout rates of the online courses are frightening. It's like 95%. And I think that's quite criminal. You're taking money off people who are never going to complete the course. But you know, I'm part of a team at the LSE that's going to be looking at this because we're really interested in, what's the other one called? Not MOOCs, but it's when you have it's sort of short online. So you're increasingly going to try and use online to try and improve the distance that your learning can access, that the people you can get to. I did a fantastic photojournalism web seminar with a bunch of photographers who are in different places around the world. One was in a refugee camp in Sudan, one was in the Bronx, one was in, I can't remember, India, I think it was. And so having that conversation about photojournalism while they were doing their work in those places was fantastic. And of course it was all recorded and other people could access it. So it's not the same as a leak, except where they don't want it to be out. You know, then it becomes a leak. But it is, yeah, it's part of the whole open internet. Information must be free, etc. But someone's got to pay for it.
Hi, my name is Jessica, and I had a question on what your opinion was on the recent visit by Google's Executive Director Eric Schmidt to North Korea, and also do you think that that will forecast perhaps a softening of ties on how the North Korean government controls information online to the populace? Thank you.
The answer to the second half is no, not in a million years. I mean, North Korea is such a freaky state that that's a technical term, but I don't think it's going to have any impact at all. It would be impossible for Google to work in North Korea at the moment. I don't know why he went. I think it was really because he was tagging along with, who's the congressman who? He's governor, sorry, apologies. Anyway, I think he was sort of tagging along with that. I think it's fascinating because, you know, Google has got a particular ethical issue. You're probably familiar with their troubles they had in China. You're probably familiar with their work in, is it Google in Hong Kong, where they've, you know, made compromises. And it's fascinating talking to their corporate affairs people because they, in a sense, it was silly to say, what's the phrase, do no evil? It's silly to have an absolute sense. If you're such an important organisation in the world, you have to start thinking politically. Interestingly, Julian Assange wasn't very good, actually, at thinking politically. He was very good at thinking absolutely, but he was very poor at thinking about how do you actually affect change. And I think Google is now in that position where 5 years ago, it could do that stuff about, hey man, information must be free and do no harm. But I'm sorry, you become so embedded in people's lives that you do have to now think politically. And politics is, as you know, the art of compromise. So in that sense, I certainly don't condemn. I know he got a lot of stick in the States for going to North Korea, but I certainly wouldn't condemn him. I'm slightly suspicious of the sense that it was, how can you put it, something of a stunt. You know, that it was a way of saying, Google can go to places where freedom, you know, cannot reach. We will try and bring, you know, freedom to these benighted places. Well, that's good, and I hope one day people are able to. But it's very important that, and I'm not at all anti-corporate whatsoever, but it's very important that these corporations who effectively run the internet, Google runs search in the world, basically. And so it's incredibly important that they are held to account. In that sense, Google isn't much more accountable than WikiLeaks, but it's increasingly becoming so because, as somebody else said, you know, it's got stock, you know, it's got a share price and it's subject to laws.